For years, football moved toward a simple conclusion. The team with the ball controlled the game. Possession became more than a tactic. It became a measure of superiority. More passes meant more authority. More territory meant more dominance. The ball itself became proof of control. And as the game evolved, that belief only grew stronger. If you could keep possession long enough, football seemed to suggest the result would eventually follow. But hidden inside that idea was a flaw, because possession controls where the game is played, not necessarily how it is felt. A team can have the ball and still feel vulnerable. A defender can spend most of the match in control and still fear the next transition. And no player exposed that contradiction more completely than Didier Drogba. He didn't need long periods of possession. He didn't need endless combinations or territorial dominance. Somehow, a single touch from him could create more uncertainty than an entire minute of controlled build-up. Which raises a question that sits at the center of modern football. If control belongs to the team with the ball, why did some of the greatest possession teams in history spend so much time worrying about a striker who barely touched it? Years later, against the greatest possession side of his generation, Drogba would force football to confront that question directly. But before that night, before the trophies and the defining moments, there was a player who seemed completely out of place in the direction the game was heading. Football usually knows what it wants from its future stars: technical precision, early recognition, a development path that feels inevitable in hindsight. Didier Drogba never fit that pattern. His journey toward the highest level was unusually slow, filled with detours rather than momentum. While many elite players were already being identified as the future of the sport, Drogba was still searching for stability within it. There was no sense that football had discovered its next great striker. If anything, he looked like the kind of player modern football was beginning to move away from. Part of that came from how he played. Drogba's game was physical, direct, and often unpredictable. He didn't glide through matches with elegance. He imposed himself on them. Defenders felt him before they understood him. Every duel became a contest. Every aerial ball became a confrontation. Every loose possession suddenly carried consequence. Yet those qualities often appeared crude when compared to the increasingly sophisticated football emerging across Europe. The game was becoming more structured, more positional, more focused on collective control. Drogba looked like a disruption inside that trend rather than a product of it. But that apparent mismatch concealed something deeper. While others viewed football through possession and organization, Drogba understood it through pressure. He recognized how uncertainty could spread through a defense, how one run could force hesitation, how one physical duel could alter the emotional state of an entire backline. Long before he became a great goal scorer, he was already becoming something more unusual. A player who changed the psychological conditions of a match simply by existing within it. And that distinction would eventually become impossible to ignore. Because as football moved further towards systems built on control, Drogba would emerge as the player capable of disrupting them most effectively. The very qualities that seemed outdated would become his greatest advantage. Years later, against the most sophisticated possession structures the game had ever produced, those same rough edges would stop looking like limitations. They would start looking like answers. By the late 2000s, football was becoming increasingly convinced it had discovered the future. The game was moving towards structure, circulation, and positional control. Managers sought to reduce uncertainty through organization. Build-up patterns became more sophisticated. Possession statistics became more important. The best teams no longer wanted to attack quickly. They wanted to control every phase before the attack even began. And at the center of that evolution stood one idea. If you controlled the ball, you controlled the match. No team represented that belief more completely than Barcelona. They did not simply keep possession, they transformed it into a philosophy. Opponents were forced to chase shadows, spending long periods without the ball, gradually losing their ability to influence the game itself. Possession was no longer just an attacking tool, it became a defensive one. The ball acted as protection. Every completed pass reduced risk. Every passing sequence increased control. Watching Barcelona felt less like watching a football match and more like watching a system slowly remove uncertainty from the field. The influence of that philosophy spread across Europe. Teams began measuring dominance through possession percentages. Midfielders were judged by ball retention. Coaches sought technical security above almost everything else. Football increasingly treated control and possession as interchangeable concepts. If one team had 70% of the ball and the other had 30%, the conclusion felt obvious. One side was imposing itself, the other was surviving. At least, that was the assumption. But assumptions become dangerous when they stop being questioned. Because while football was becoming obsessed with who owned the ball, it paid less attention to what happened when possession was broken. A single transition, a single duel, a single long pass toward a striker capable of turning control into panic. And that is where Didier Drogba became such an uncomfortable presence in the modern game. Because every touch he took seemed to challenge the era's central belief. If possession truly controlled football, why did entire defenses become nervous the moment the ball reached him? Years later, against Barcelona themselves, that question would become impossible to ignore. The 2012 Champions League semi-final between Chelsea and Barcelona looked, on the surface, like the ultimate validation of possession football. Barcelona controlled the ball, controlled territory, and controlled the rhythm of almost every phase. Chelsea spent long periods defending deep, absorbing wave after wave of pressure. If possession truly measured dominance, the contest should have felt one-sided. Yet beneath the numbers, something unusual was happening. Barcelona were controlling where the game was played, but they were struggling to control what the game felt like. Every time Chelsea recovered possession, the match changed shape. Not because they launched intricate attacks, but because Didier Drogba transformed simple situations into dangerous ones. A clearance was no longer just a clearance when Drogba was waiting underneath it. A long pass was no longer an act of desperation. It became a weapon. Barcelona's defenders weren't worried about Chelsea building sustained attacks. They were worried about the consequences of losing a single duel. And that fear began to alter their decisions long before the ball reached them. This is what made Drogba such a unique threat against possession-based teams. Most strikers depend on service. They require the game to flow toward them. Drogba reversed that relationship. The game adjusted itself around his presence. Defenders became more cautious. Fullbacks hesitated before committing forward. Midfielders thought twice about counter-pressing aggressively. The irony was striking. Barcelona had the ball for most of the match, yet one of the biggest factors shaping their behavior was a player who rarely touched it. Possession was dictating movement. Drogba was dictating emotion. And that is where the deeper realization begins to emerge. Football had spent years treating control as something visible. Passes completed, territory gained, possession accumulated. Drogba exposed a different form of control entirely. The ability to influence decisions without possession. The ability to create anxiety without sustained attacks. The ability to make the most dominant team in the world constantly aware of what might happen next. Barcelona controlled the ball that night. But Drogba controlled the possibility that their control could disappear at any moment. And suddenly, possession no longer looked like the complete answer football believed it was. What made Didier Drogba exceptional was never simply his ability to score goals. Football history is filled with prolific scorers. What separated Drogba was his relationship with pressure. The bigger the occasion became, the more naturally the game seemed to move toward him. Cup finals, title races, European nights, situations that often make players cautious appeared to have the opposite effect on him. While others became consumed by the magnitude of the moment, Drogba seemed to understand that pressure itself could be used as a weapon, not against himself, but against everyone around him. That understanding became one of the foundations of Chelsea's identity under Jose Mourinho. Chelsea were often described as pragmatic, defensive, even reactive. But those descriptions miss something important. They suggest a team waiting for opportunities rather than creating them. Drogba changed that reality. He gave Chelsea a way of threatening opponents without needing what become an attack. Every defensive phase could become the beginning of a transition. His presence ensured that Chelsea were never truly defending. They were simply waiting for the next moment to shift the balance of the game. The psychological effect of that threat spread throughout the team. Midfielders could defend deeper because they trusted Drogba to relieve pressure when possession returned. Defenders could clear long rather than forcing dangerous passes because they knew he could turn difficult situations into manageable ones. Even supporters sensed it. There was a growing belief that as long as Drogba remained on the pitch, the match was never fully under the opponent's control. Not because victory was guaranteed, but because certainty never was. And in football, uncertainty is often more powerful than momentum. The trophies eventually followed: Premier League titles, domestic cups, the Champions League. Yet those achievements are best understood as evidence rather than explanation. They prove his importance without fully defining it. Drogba's true contribution was larger than any individual medal or statistic. He became the embodiment of a different footballing idea, one that challenged an era increasingly obsessed with possession and technical purity. While others sought control through the ball, Drogba repeatedly demonstrated that influence could come from somewhere else entirely. And that realization would leave a lasting mark on how football understood dominance itself. The lasting significance of Didier Drogba is not that he disproved possession football. Possession remains one of the most effective tools the game has ever developed. The deeper truth is that he exposed its limitation. Football had gradually convinced itself that control could be measured through ownership of the ball. The more a team possessed it, the more control it supposedly had. Drogba forced the game to confront a more uncomfortable reality. Possession can influence a match, but it cannot fully define it. What ultimately decides football matches is not who has the ball, but what happens when the ball changes hands. The moment possession ends, certainty disappears. Structure becomes vulnerable, distances become exposed, decisions become urgent. And few players in football history understood those moments better than Drogba. He recognized that a single transition could outweigh minutes of circulation. That one duel could undo an entire sequence of controlled possession. That fear, uncertainty, and pressure often travel faster than the ball itself. In the years that followed, subtle ways, even the most possession-oriented teams became increasingly aware of transitions. Counter-pressing evolved. Rest defense became a tactical obsession. Coaches spent more time preparing for what might happen after losing possession than ever before. The game did not abandon possession football, it refined it. And hidden inside that refinement was an acknowledgement of the very problem Drogba had exposed. Control was no longer understood as simply keeping the ball. It became about managing the consequences of losing it. That is why Drogba's legacy extends beyond goals, trophies, or even Chelsea itself. He represented a contradiction that football could not ignore. A striker who often touched the ball less than his opponents, yet influenced their decisions more than many players who possessed it constantly. A player who revealed that dominance and possession were not synonyms. And in doing so, he left behind a lesson that still shapes the modern game. Possession can control where football is played, but true control belongs to the player who determines what happens next.